I want to do a tutorial about wrap sunglasses. A wrap sunglass that has a good shape this way, that fits tight against someone's face. It needs to be processed specially. We'll first talk about how to identify frames that need specifically the high curve bevel on the Lex 1000. We'll talk about identifying the frames that need that curve. We'll talk about why they need the curve and what it is that we're doing with that special curve. Then we'll discuss a little bit about ordering the lenses from your lab. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about processing in the Lex 1000. You'll hear me specifically talk a lot about the Brazen. It's a frame that that we like to use at Second Specs, and you'll hear me talk about the Unrest. But we'll also like to use that special bevel on stuff like the Justin and the new Wayfarer. Now these frames are pretty flat, but we're still going to use the high curve on them. The reason for using the high curve, not necessarily just because there's a steep curve here on the frame, but because the front of the bevel, because the front side of the bevel is bigger than the back side of the bevel. If you look at this frame and you can see here's the front of the bevel and here is the back of the bevel, if you can look at it from the front of the lens and you see that the back side of this bevel is smaller in circumference than the front side of this bevel, then we're going to want to use that. Otherwise, your lens is going to impact right here on the back side. It's going to pop out. Will also result in this frame being stretched open like this. It's not going to retain the fit and feel of when the customer tried it on originally. And that's going to happen also in these flat frames. It happens though more here in the nasal, and it impacts right in here, and then we get a chip in the back of the lens eventually, perhaps not right when the customer picks up the lens or when we're popping the lens in, but over the next month or so we'll find a chip happening right in here where it impacts, and then we have an unhappy customer. A standard Haida bevel looks like this. Here's the front of your lens here towards you, and it's going to have a slight curve here, come up to the peak of your bevel, back down, and then slowly taper off like that. And then there's the back of our lens. Now that bevel is designed to fit in a frame that has a standard V bevel that is going to have a profile like this, and that bevel will fit right into the side of the frame there and hold it nice and secure. However, when we are talking about a frame that needs the special bevel, we'll have a profile that is deep at the back like this, and that's the back where you can see the back of the frame has a smaller circumference than the front part of this bevel. Again, like this, how you can see the front part of the bevel, the front part of the frame has a larger circumference than the back part of the frame, and you will get this style of a profile of how that bevel works. And then our standard frame just doesn't fit in there. It's going to rest on the back part of the lens, and it's not going to fit in. So either you're going to have the frame twist like this, or you're going to have the lens pop out because it's only holding on this little tip, and it's going to pop out, and you're generally going to get our frames when it impacts here on the back. Let me turn it this way so it matches. So when it impacts here on the back of the bevel, the frame will bend out like this and the lens will pop out. So we're going to have an awkward shape and we're going to have a poor fit. So instead of using a standard bevel, we need to have a bevel. If this again So instead of having our standard bevel, we need to have a bevel where this back is chopped down and really cleaned up in there so that it will fit in that profile. So this profile will fit right into that frame. It doesn't impact on the back of the frame at all, and we've got quite a bit of this V that covers in there so that we have a lot of lens holding on to the frame so that it holds in nice and securely. Let's also talk a little bit about Oakley's while we're discussing wrap frames. Oakley has a strange profile that looks like this, and it's very square like this, and so none of our shapes are going to even fit in that. Some are very deep like this. If you look at the gas can, the old gas can, this is even deeper than this. It goes way out at the temple. That's got a very, very steep profile. But even if it's a short profile, like in a frog skin, we might be able to fit in here a little bit and have so much coverage in that bevel, but for the large part we're not holding on to the whole bevel, which is why I would suggest, unless you have some very specialized tools, send it right to Oakley, let them deal with it. This is not suitable for us to make, especially on our edgers that we use at Second Specs, the Lex 1000, the Lex 1500, the Lex 1200. They will do a profile that is similar to this, and it is very good for this kind of a frame, which is what we see in Nike, what we see in Ray-Bans, what we see in Smith, Arnett. All of those guys we should be able to do no problem. So you've identified your frame. This frame we want to be special. We need to order it properly, because if the lens is not ordered on the proper curve, then you are going to end up with a lot of trouble trying to edge it. First off, the Lex 1000 will not edge on the high curve mode if the base curve of the lens is shallower than 3.5. So if you're going to plan on doing the special bevel, you need to at least order a 3.5 curve. Otherwise it won't even process. The computer in the Lex 1000 will just lock it right up. So let's talk a little bit about base curves and what base curves are and how to select a base curve. So if you think that the prescription of the lens is the front base curve plus the back base curve, you will get your actual prescription. So if we say this is a plano on the front and a -5 on the back, our prescription is going to be -5. If we have a 3 base on the front and an 8 base on the back, we are going to have a -5. So in that way we can make different curved lenses with the same power. So when we decide we want to use the special bevel, we are first going to see what the curve of this frame is. Now typically with the Brazen and the Unrest we're dealing with a 5.5 base curve. When you're looking at the Wayfarers, you will want to be probably in around the 4 base curve for those guys. Some other ones you're going to be 6 or 8. I would consult you not to just lens clock the front of this lens, because that's going to give you a curve of the lens, not of the frame bevel that we need. You're better off if you put that in your tracer and look at it on the edger. The edger will tell you what the exact base curve of the frame is, not the lens. So if we're dealing with a Brazen that has a 5.5 base curve like this, make it nice and dark so you can see it, we need to match that base curve somewhere on the lens. And we don't necessarily want it right on the back of the lens. So 3 kind of choices you want to look at. If we order a -5, which I've put a -5 in the Brazen, and yeah, it's thick and it looks weird, but the patient is generally happy with it because they can't get anything else that's even like that, or anybody else who will even do a decent job of it. If we order it on a plano base, which is probably what your stock lens is going to be, roughly a plano, we've got a 5 base curve right here on the back, and our bevel design will probably go through the lens something like that in order to get that 5 base curve onto our bevel. And so we are going to be dealing with a huge chunk sticking out of the front and a little bevel on the back like this. Fitting in there is going to look goofy as hell. Consequently, if we order a 5 base curve on the front to match that, yes, our bevel is going to be real nice matched to the front. We're not going to get any white ring. But to get a -5, we're going to have like a 10 base curve on the back. We're going to have this huge thickness here in the lens. And we're going to have this little bevel up front here. Will come off like that. And then it will go down here. And it's going to be god-awful thick out here on the edge. And yes, our bevel is going to go nicely matching the front curve, but the finished product is going to look horrible, and the patient's not going to be able to look out of a 10 base curve on the back. It's going to be horrible for them. They're going to have about this much visual field, and they're not going to be able to see anything. I would try and keep it somewhere in the middle. All we need is to be able to put a 5 base curve somewhere on that lens. Doesn't have to follow the back, doesn't have to follow the front. Can be somewhere nicely here in the middle that's shallower than the back and a little steeper than the front, and we'll get a nice lens. So if we're looking at a plano, yes, I would order it on that 5.5. I would order it on a 5.5 base curve. If we're dealing with a -1, -2, we can order it on a 450, a little bit shallower, because we don't want that back to get too steep. So selecting the proper base curve is essential. Otherwise, we're going to have a very large problem when we go to processing and edging it. We're going to end up with something, if we don't specify with a base curve, we're going to end up with something like this. And if you try to edge something like this into a frame with this curve, you're going to end up with a lot of problems, and you will probably have to redo the lens anyway. Or if you put that lens, if you force it with this bevel near the back into that frame, the patient's not going to like it, and you'll probably end up with having to do a refund on it. So if you start looking at, typically we're not going to do a lot of -5s in wrap frames. We're going to be in the plano to -3 range. Even a +3, if you start looking at pluses, getting higher curves on them is easier. But the plano to -3 range, you're going to want to be in that 4.5, 5.5 range. On a -3, you might go down to a 4, depending on the curve of the frame. Again, in the brazen, a -3 I would put on a 4 base. If we're talking about a flatter frame that has, like the Justin, which is more like a 3 or 3.5 curve on the front, then we would go to our minimum 3.5 to run in the Lex 1000. If you don't have a lot of experience selecting base curves, ask someone who does have some experience. There's a lot of people in our association. There's a lot of people within Second Specs who have a lot of experience with this. Just text them; they'll be happy to help you out. Say, I'm working with a -3. I'm trying to put it in the brazen. The curve is 5.5. What base curve should I order it on? And we'd be happy to help you out. So use that experience when selecting a base curve, and you will gradually get some experience on this yourself. So specific to the Lex 1000 edger now, we'll start with tracing. Now, a lot of times, because these frames have a lot of curve this way, you can't trace it by just putting it in a normal fashion, the way you would put in a normal frame like this, because as the pin comes up into here, it's going to fall out in this steep curve. So quite often you have to trace just one eye, and you take it out of the the claws on the one side, and you kind of tip it up so that it's flat on the one side, and then you can just trace one eye and give this a little stability here with your hand as you go around, and it will trace without falling out. Do this, it's going to run it on this wheel here on the side with the huge, this large deep bevel, and it does that because now we can cut the front side first and then the back side independently, and in that way we can kind of design what we want the bevel to look like. It's just going to sense the front first, and then it's going to go on the roughing wheel and crib it down, and it does that because if this was a very high curved lens, then the back of the lens here would interfere with the tracing. So it cribs it down so there's not any chance of that interfering with the lens. So that's typically normal. It's not going to ask us what to do until after it senses both sides after we crib it down. So now that it's cribbed, it's just sensing the back, so we can see now it'll sense the back and the front, and then it will give us our options of how we want to design our bevel. Start with this spinning around like this, and you can just hit any key to stop it, and I usually like to stop it here at the top, so this center line indicates where this is, and these lines will indicate where it's at. So as we spin it, you can see that this is more moving towards the nasal. Here's the nasal part here, and we can decide where we want to look at it from. I typically like to look at it from the top down, so I will move around to the top and then stop it there. Now, first thing you want to do is the bevel curve. The bevel curve, we want to get as close as we can to this frame curve. So we're just going to start increasing that. Now, you really need to be within 0.5, otherwise we're going to start to stretch the frame out, and we're going to have these splayed out legs. The arms on there are going to be hard to fit on a face. The next one is our bevel position. Is going to be, I'll zoom in here. If we take a look at this, is our bevel. So here's the back of the lens, and here's the front curve of the lens, and we can see where the front of the bevel is, the peak of the bevel, and then the back of the bevel. What you want to make sure is that you do not cut off any more than 70% of the bevel. We need to have at least 30% of that bevel still there. So I am going to move it, the negative moves it front, positive moves it to the back. Now we want it up close to the front, otherwise we're going to have a white ring around here, especially if we have a much flatter lens than we have a curve. But we don't want it too close to the front. So if we're this far back, we're definitely going to end up with some kind of a white ring around here. If we keep it closer here to the front, there's not going to be a white ring, but now there's not enough lens, not enough bevel for the frame to hold on to. So you have to have a minimum amount of about 20% of the whole width. So this here, this width is the whole amount that we can have. And then the next one, that's typical guided bevel for us on this machine, but the next mode is the bevel height. Now what that's going to do is that's going to start to increase how deep this back bevel goes, so that this is the spot right here where it's going to impact on the frame, and we want to start to take that off. So as we increase this bevel height, you can see how it starts to take all of that off. Now quite often it'll take off almost all of that ridge all the way around the frame. I like to go to at least 1.8. 1.8 is what I do on just about everything, the Unrest, on the Wayfarer, on the Brazen. All will end up being a bevel height of 1.8. Once in a while, if I'm doing a patient's own frame, I might get a little bit higher to a 2, but most typically I'll do 1.8. The other option that we have over here is tilt, and I would suggest not to play around with this, but just so that you know what it is, it's going to change the angle here, it's going to move this bevel back and this bevel forward. So if we start to increase that, you can see how it changes where that bevel curve goes, and that allows us to keep the front of the lens flat compared to where the eye looks out of, and still keep that bevel quite wrapped so that it fits in the frame. Again, I don't like to play with that much. I like to just leave that right where it's at. If we have a frame where we need to play with that quite a bit, I would suggest just don't sell that frame. With the brazens, with the unrests, we don't have that issue. Just leave it at 0.5. So it starts by doing the front curve of the bevel, of the special bevel. And now we'll go along and do the back curve of the bevel in the position we want it. And in that way we can make this lens fit a wrapped frame with that overhang quite well. Now you can see how that bevel is off on the back here. There's no hide bevel left on it, and that should not impact on the back of the frame. Also important to note, this is not going to feather. The feathering mode on the Lex 1000 does not work when you use the high curve, so you're going to have to do that by hand. Although in some cases it will, when it takes off all of the back, there's no ridge there anyway, and most of it will be hidden behind the lens or behind the frame. But you should take that down by hand a little bit if you have a hand edger. When you insert this, you of course want to start with the tightest corners first, which is your nasal and your temple. But typically with these ones we want to get the temple sides in first and then kind of bend it around for the nasal. Be very careful because this point is usually pretty tight and you might chip it. That's usually where we chip it if you're inserting it. Now, if you have a hand wheel, you can just run a light feather along this surface here, right along here. We just use the file here and just take a little bit off there, and that way it's not quite so sharp and it slides in. If you're filing it, no more than just the pressure of the file. You don't want to push against it, otherwise you're going to chip that lens. And then once you get that a little bit round along this surface, it should pop right in. If you are a little too big, you do have the option to edge it down. So you can go into your retouch mode. You can change the size here. Now I have this particular one edged 0.2 large because we know this frame to need to be 0.2 large. However, you don't have to edge all of them large. You can if you want and take them down. So what we would do here is just take that down a tenth. Hit start. It will give us the options here again where we can adjust the back side of the bevel. So we can't adjust the bevel curve or the bevel position because that's already kind of set in the lens. But we can go ahead and adjust the bevel height again if we want to change that height. If we found that there was an impact point out on the temple or the nasal that we wanted to get rid of, we can put it back in and take the back down by another couple tenths, and we would be able to retouch that lens in order for it to fit better. We ended up with having no white ring around it. It's a little bit here in the way corner, but pretty good. So our bevel position was good. What you want to check is when you hold this frame and you put some pressure out like this, if the lens doesn't pop out, you're pretty good. If you can stretch that frame out, then it's the lens is in there secure. What you want to look for here is that, let's see if we can get some light on this, is right in the corners here, if there's any impact points around here. Now typically you can get your fingernail in all the way around it and you can feel that there's a gap in between the lens and the frame anywhere. And you also want to check to see that this shape is maintained, and that if you stretch the temples out like this, the lenses are not popping out. The lenses are in nice and secure. There's no popping of them here. Quite often they'll just go shooting right out as you stretch that out. And then a kind of a final test, just try it on and make sure that it's not stretched out so big that it won't fit over your face. When we're doing a wrapped sunglass, we want to make sure that the finished product is something that is going to fit good, is going to look good, and ultimately the patient is going to be able to see out of. And so we have to bring all of these things together. We have to identify the frame is something that needs a special curve. We need to order the lens properly. We need to edge the lens properly and fit the lens properly, because once the lens is in there, there's no heating of these frames. These don't bend at all. The material that they make most of these sunglasses out of just doesn't heat up and adjust. So we have to start right so that we can end right with a finished product that is perfect. Follow those steps and you should be able to produce a nice looking frame. Frames that we're mostly going to be dealing with are Nike. We do deal with a few of the Ray-Bans, again, Brazen, Unrest, the new Wayfarer, the Justin, the classic Wayfarer. I use that bevel as well. But you're going to want to identify them yourself, because you're going to get a patient's own frame in a Maui gym or something, and you're going to want to identify it as, this is a special case. Let's start the job properly so the finished product ends up right.